If you follow the geopolitical change, and there's no surprise today that our geopolitical world is getting more and more complicated. And for example, paying closer attention to what's happening in the US today, especially after Donald Trump brought back the White House. Not only that today we're seeing more chaos and also protests on the street towards his specific policies, but meanwhile, it is crucial we need to understand some of the rhetoric. And for example, we're very surprised at how much Donald Trump or the current Trump administration is very much obsessed with the nation of Canada. Now, more than one occasion that Donald Trump mentioned that Canada could be the next 51st states. And of course, that this is not going to happen in reality, but that doesn't stop Donald Trump from mentioning over and over again. But this is now the first time that we've seen this friction between the two countries. Now, in this episode, we need to understand from the historical perspective, how do we understand what's happening today? Remember one thing, what happened in the past could directly relate to what's happening today and also at this moment. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Miss Madeline Drohan. Madeline is a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Policy at the University of Ottawa. And she was a former Canada correspondent for The Economist. During her long journalism career, she covered politics, economics, and business in Africa, Asia, Canada, and Europe. And she's the author of the forthcoming book, He Did Not Conquer, Benjamin Franklin's Failure to Annex Canada, and now she lives in Ottawa. Well, Madeline, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for having me on, Will.
Well, Madeline, I have to say that it's such a fascinating book that when we talk about the relationship between Canada and US at this moment, now again, as I mentioned before, I'm not done with the book yet, but the more I read about it and the more fascinated I am about this story that you told about Benjamin Franklin. I know that this is not a biography of Benjamin Franklin, but I do want to ask, in the book that you wrote and documented regarding this, what you called Canada Project under Benjamin Franklin. I want to start from there. Can you help us walk through specifically what was the Canada Project for Benjamin Franklin, and why did you write that for Benjamin Franklin that he considered as the mystery at that moment? Your thoughts?
Okay, well, I think Canada loomed large in Benjamin Franklin's life, although it's not usually covered in the other biographies of him. I mean, from his very birth in Boston, the people in that English colony were at war with the people in Canada, which was a French colony. So he was aware of Canada as a threat from the very beginning. But as his thinking went on, he started to think about the American project, still as a British colony, but he was the first one, I think, to come up with the idea that it was really the manifest destiny of the Americans to occupy the entire continent. So just to give you some time frame here, he was born in 1706. In about the 1750s, he started thinking along these lines. And then after that, he started to be more vocal about it. So when Britain took over, forced the French out of North America and took over Canada, Benjamin Franklin wrote a very well-publicized pamphlet that's called the Canada Pamphlet, where basically he argued that Britain should hang on to Canada and sort of, so it could be a fellow British colony in North America. Moving on further, when the American colonists started to decide they didn't want Britain on the continent either, Benjamin Franklin was then pushing for Canada to become part of the United States. He only made one visit to Canada in 1776. That was when the American colonists had invaded, and he came up to salvage that invasion. And his very last attempt at Canada was in 1782, when he was chief negotiator for the Americans in Paris, and he wanted Britain to give Canada to the Americans sort of as a gift to seal those negotiations. So it was a long, when I say it's a project, it went over decades.
Well, Madeline, I want to talk about Benjamin Franklin. Again, we know that not only he's one of the founding fathers for the US, but also most people were rather deeply impressed by Benjamin Franklin's diplomatic charm. I mean, again, he went out of his ways to make friends with friends, and also, of course, that along the way he created, I mean, I don't want to say he created, but he made enemies as well. Not everyone bought into the idea or bought into the strategies that he implemented. But also in your book, Madeline, you talk about that his role during the Revolution period, and I think that related to his interest in Canada as well. So I want you to talk a little bit more. What is the correlation between the Revolution period and also his personal interest in Canada? What is the connection to that?
Okay. Well, as I said, he had this long-standing interest, but when he was really able to act on it came during the Revolutionary period. You mentioned his diplomacy, and he was the most experienced American diplomat at the time. He had spent years in London representing the colonies. At the time, he still considered himself British, right up until the point of 1775, when it looked like he kept thinking that at some point Britain and the 13 colonies would sort of mend their differences, that there did not have to be a rupture. But once there was a rupture, that's when he decided that really he wanted independence for what he was calling the United States at that point, but he also wanted Canada to be part of that. And I mentioned he's an experienced diplomat because then the 13 colonies decided to send him over to France as well. So he continued being a diplomat. He did make friends, he did make enemies. I think some of his fellow founding fathers, and I'm thinking here of John Adams in particular, were a bit skeptical about Benjamin Franklin, because they thought he was a bit slippery. From what I could tell, John Adams was very sort of straight-laced, really saw right and wrong in terms of black and white. Benjamin Franklin saw shades of gray. And so there was that sort of internal dissension among the founding fathers, which doesn't often get played up there. But certainly Franklin's diplomacy was successful in the end for the United States. It's just he didn't get Canada.
Madeline, let's continue our conversation about Benjamin Franklin. I mean, again, this, as I mentioned before, it's a fascinating book that you put together to look at the relationship between Canada and the US from the historical perspective and through the lens of Benjamin Franklin. Now, by looking at the content, that you divide the book into 3 sections. Now, one section particularly stood out to me, and the chapter, which is entitled A Dangerous Man, Philadelphia in 1726 to 1748. I don't want to give everything away, but can you help us with a bit of taste? Let's start with, who was the dangerous man, and why Philadelphia at that period? And we know that through study of the history, Philadelphia, it's really the land of opportunities, and also it's the land of conflicts and controversies and stories and struggles. Can get very personal and also emotional. But within this book, when we look at Philadelphia, it's not really the usual type of story that we were thinking about. There's something much deeper and something much more engaging, meaningful behind this. So help us. Who was the dangerous man, and why Philadelphia during that period?
Well, Philadelphia, I mean, these days people don't think of it as sort of the center of the United States, but at the time it was. Just to place it in context of Franklin's life, I mean, people know him as a printer, as the person that published Poor Richard's Almanac, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and that. And certainly that's all part of Franklin's life, a big part. It doesn't play a huge part in my book because he retired very early and decided to get involved more with politics, well, public service to a certain extent, but also politics. And that's where the whole dangerous man comes in, because there was a big debate in Pennsylvania between the proprietor of that colony, Penn, which the colony is made, and the people who actually lived there about who should pay taxes, and specifically who should pay taxes for the defense of Pennsylvania. And in this case, they're defending themselves against the French Canadians, who would be attacking with their indigenous allies, various settlements and that. Anyhow, huge debate. This is among the colonists and the proprietor about who should be paying for this defense. And the proprietor didn't want to have his estates taxed. And Benjamin Franklin led several efforts to impose taxes on those estates. And so the dangerous man came in. That's how the proprietor saw Franklin, that he was very sort of working behind the scenes all the time, and you really had to keep an eye on him. And in the end, I'm not sure. There was no clear victor out of that particular fight, although I guess the victor was the colonists in the end when they announced their independence years later.
Well, again, Madeline, we know that throughout the entire revolution, and also we look at history of the U.S., no one was perfect. As a matter of fact, that you mentioned regarding John Adams, and we look at all the different founding fathers, and they all had different plans or ambitions to unite the country. But I want to continue to talk about your book, another chapter, which is towards the end of the part 3, is called The Final Attempt. Now, this time, we're not talking about Philadelphia, but we're talking about Paris, the period of 1776 to 1783. And again, I wouldn't call myself an expert on American history, but we know that 1776, July the 4th, that was a crucial date for the U.S. I mean, it's the day that celebrated freedom and celebrate liberation. But what really happened there? Again, I'm not there yet, but I want you to give us the bit taste of what was the final attempt in Paris and during that 1776 to 1783, and why was that even crucial? Or even better question, why did you decide to use that story or use that period to conclude this book? Your thoughts?
Well, I can't talk about Paris in 1782 without talking about what happened in 1775 and 1776. So I'll just take a quick detour back there, if you don't mind.
Sounds great.
1775, the 13 colonists had it with Britain, and they decided it was building. Let me put it that way. And there were... No, I'm going to stop for a sec. Sorry. I'm actually going to go back to 1774.
Okay.
Which is when the 13 colonies decided to get together in what they called a Continental Congress in Philadelphia. We're back to Philadelphia now. And they were trying to decide, what are they going to do with Britain? How are they going to change this relationship? Because Britain was trying to tax them. They didn't want to pay taxes. Taxes is a big theme throughout American history. Anyhow, they got together and they decided they needed allies in the fight against Britain. And they wrote this letter to the French Canadians, basically saying, join us in our fight against the British government. But that letter had a few threats in it too, veiled threats like, be our friends or else you're going to be our enemies. Anyhow, French Canadians did not reply to that letter or subsequent letters for very good reasons. They saw the American colonists as another branch of the English family. Why would they get involved with what they saw was a family dispute, basically? So most of them, not all of them, but most of them just sort of hung back. Anyhow, when the Continental Congress didn't get any reply that the French Canadians were on board, they decided that they couldn't leave that situation the way it was because it was a British colony and Britain might just use it as a launching pad to attack the 13 colonies. So now we're into 1775. There are these battles between the British and the colonists at Lexington and Concord. And the delegates to the Continental Congress decided they can't leave this threat in Canada hanging. Britain might attack from there. So they decided, let's invade Canada. And they were operating on very bad intelligence because they had been told the Canadians were just waiting with open arms. They couldn't wait for them to get there. That's really not the way it happened. And so that invasion, they took Montreal, they took Trois-Rivières, which were the two of the three big population centers at the time. And then things started to really fall apart. And the Continental Congress decided they needed someone to go and salvage the invasion. So they sent Benjamin Franklin along with two other, very senior delegates up to Montreal to see if they could save things. They couldn't. The British sent reinforcements. The army from the 13 colonies went rushing home. So that brings us to actually July 1st, 1776. I'm sorry, it's a long way to get there, but you need to understand the failed invasion and that. So on the basis of that, they tried to get Canada, they failed, and then they declared independence. But just declaring independence does not make you independent.
That's right.
They had to get the recognition from other countries that, yes, indeed, you're independent. And they were looking for allies. And they decided France might be a good ally, which was unusual at the time. France had been their sworn enemy for centuries. And yet they've appealing to it, help us fight Britain. And actually France said, yeah, because Britain was their enemy too. Yes, so they managed to get the French on board, but they still had to resolve things with Britain. And so Franklin, again, was sent over to Paris first to do a deal with the French and then to negotiate with the British. And this is where it ended up being his final attempt, because he was there as one of, there was a revolving cast of negotiators, but he was there the whole time trying to figure out a deal with Britain. But Canada was never far from his mind. One of the British negotiators, a man called Oswald, had written to someone else at the time saying he'd just seen Franklin for one of their many meetings and that Franklin had once again brought up Canada. I mean, Oswald made him sound like he was a broken record. And I'm sure this wasn't sort of his top priority, but he always worked it into things. And he during those months in 1782, as a deal was starting to be formed, Franklin kept saying Britain should give the 13 colonies Canada as sort of a compensation, a gift, whatever. And it looked for a while like that might happen. But in the end, the British decided, no, that wasn't something they wanted to give. And the Americans decided that it wasn't something they wanted to really fight for.
Well, Madeleine, again, the more you describe the details, not only about what happened in 1776, but the whole process or even the procedure that negotiation took place in the past surely, I would say, triggered much greater interest for me as a reader. Will continue reading your book. Now, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Fast forward 2025. Donald Trump. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Not the first time, and it won't be the last time that he talked about bringing Canada into the United States as the 51st states. Of course, we've seen and also we heard the Canadian government loud and clear, Canada will never be part of the US. And again, this has never been, this can't put in a better way. So you as an author that wrote this book from the historical perspective through the lens of Benjamin Franklin, what have we learned today, especially when we listen to Donald Trump's rhetoric about acquiring Canada as the 51st states? Is this only a pipe dream, or how much do you think that he's going to keep on talking? Eventually, Donald Trump is going to give up on this pipe dream and realize this will never happen during his presidency. Your final thoughts?
Well, one of the things I learned from researching and then writing this book is that this whole idea of manifest destiny in the United States has very deep roots. It was there at the very beginning, and it crops up from time to time. It so happens that I would say for ever since the Second World War, that it's sort of been in abeyance. And now Trump has resurrected it. So it's not new. It had just faded for a while, and it had faded for long enough that Canadians were getting a little bit too relaxed about having the United States as their neighbor. And in sort of a related line, in the whole history of Canadians, and I call them Americans, although even before the two countries actually existed, for about 2 centuries of that, they were mortal enemies. And then for this most recent period, they were friends. So the question is, are we going back to what really is the normal relationship there? It would be a surprise for Canadians. And yet when you look at the long trend of history, you can see that perhaps that is indeed possible. So I see Trump as, we thought when he first started talking about this that he was making a joke. It now seems like he's serious. And I do believe that he will continue on this path. He might not talk about it as much, but he will try through this economic coercion to eventually make Canada the 51st state.
Well, again, we don't know what will happen between US and Canada. And surely, given the fact that, again, as I mentioned before, the geopolitics is getting more and more complicated. And the last thing we want for the international community is to face another major war, either from this political or economic standpoint. We want international peace, and we hope that Donald Trump is able to understand that principle. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's surely a great honor to speak to Miss Madeleine Drouin. Again, Madeleine is a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Policy at the University of Ottawa, and she's the author of the forthcoming book, He Did Not Conquer, Benjamin Franklin's Failure to Annex Canada. Well, Madeleine, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes as we continue to talk about the relationship between Canada and US, and surely we'd love to hear more from you about this from the historical perspective about Canada and also the US. So thank you so much for doing this.